Three knocks on a door that no one in the world knew existed. February of 1889. Inside Tabletop Mountain, behind a wall of stacked waste rock and salvaged timber, behind a plank door with a handle made of twisted copper wire, a young woman stood perfectly still. She was 19 years old. She held a skinning knife in her right hand. On her left forearm, a burn scar ran from wrist to elbow white and raised and still new enough to ache when the air was cold. The air inside the mountain was always cold. She had not spoken to another human being in 5 months. The knocking came again. 3 slow raps that traveled through 80 feet of stone and quartz and arrived in the chamber not as sharp sounds, but as deep pulses she felt in her ribs. She did not move toward the door. She did not call out. She stood 4 feet behind it with the knife held low against her thigh, her weight evenly distributed on both feet, breathing through her nose. And she waited. The silence between the second set of knocks and whatever came next was the longest silence Cora Hollister had experienced in 11 months of living underground. And she had experienced many silences. But this one had a different quality. This one had a person in it. We will come back to this moment. We will come back to the door and the knocking and the decision that Cora made in the seconds that followed. But first we need to go back 11 months to the morning that put her inside this mountain. Because no one walks into an abandoned copper mine and stays for a year unless the world outside has become more dangerous than the darkness within. September the 3rd, 1888. Cora Hollister woke at 4 in the morning in the room behind the kitchen. The room had no window. It had no lock. Her uncle Aldous called it the storeroom when neighbors visited. And the word was precise in a way that Aldous probably did not intend. Because a storeroom is where you keep things you do not value enough to display, but cannot bring yourself to throw away. That was exactly what Cora had been to Aldous Hollister for 7 years. Not a niece, not a child, an object in storage. She dressed in the dark because the room had no lamp. She crossed the kitchen by memory, her bare feet knowing every creak in the floorboards after 2,500 mornings of walking the same path. She knelt at the cook stove and opened the firebox and laid kindling over last night's coals and blew until flame caught, and the first light of the day pushed her shadow up the wall behind her. Long and angular. The shadow of a woman who was 5 feet 8 inches tall and who did not hunch. Tall girls in Ridgeway were taught to shrink. They were taught to soften their shoulders and lower their eyes and stand with one hip cocked to subtract an inch or two from their height. Because height in a woman was treated as a kind of rudeness. An unwillingness to fit the space that had been allotted to her. Cora had never learned to shrink. It was one of the things that Opal hated most about her. She cooked oatmeal. She split 6 logs at the woodpile behind the house, driving the axe into pine, with a sound that cracked across the yard and bounced off the barn, and came back to her as a faint echo. And this was the sound she would remember most clearly about these 7 years. Not Aldous' voice, not the silence at dinner, not Opal's orders, the sound of her own axe at 4 in the morning, the 1 hour of the day when the work was hers even if the wood was not. She hauled water from the well, she scrubbed the kitchen table, she swept the floors, and by 6 o'clock when the rest of the house stirred, everything was ready. Everything was always ready. Because Cora had been making everything ready since the autumn of 1881 when she arrived at Aldous' door at the age of 11. Delivered by a county sheriff who carried in one hand a small girl with black hair and gray eyes, and in the other hand an envelope containing $190 in savings that her father, Aldous' younger brother, had set aside before diphtheria killed him and his wife in the same week. Aldous took the girl. Aldous took the envelope. The girl went into the storeroom. The envelope went into the desk. And in 7 years, in front of every neighbor and every minister and every passing stranger who sat at his table, Aldous Hollister never once called her by name. She was the girl. She was the child. She was most often simply a pronoun. She, her, a word that floated through Aldous' sentences without ever touching ground. A reference to a person who was present in the house the way weather was present outside a window. Acknowledged, never addressed. At 6 o'clock on the morning of September the 3rd, Opal Hollister walked into the kitchen. Opal was 34. She had married Aldous 4 months earlier and had moved into his house in Ridgeway with the focused determination of a woman who understood that this marriage was not a romance, but a transaction. She came from a poor family in Montrose. She had spent her youth watching her mother work herself thin on a failing ranch, and she had decided before she was 20 that she would not repeat that life. Aldous had a house. Aldous had land. Aldous was 45 and starting to slow down. Opal intended to be the last person standing when Aldous' health gave out, and everything she had done since moving into this house had been organized around that intention. Cora was the obstacle. Not because Cora was defiant. Cora cooked, cleaned, hauled, scrubbed, and maintained the household with the efficiency of a machine. The problem was not Cora's behavior. The problem was Cora's presence. Young, tall, quiet in a way that made Opal uneasy because quiet people are watching and Opal did not want to be watched. Living under the same roof as Opal's husband, with a self-possession that Opal, who had spent her life making herself useful to survive, could not tolerate in a girl who owned nothing and yet carried herself as though she owed nothing. That morning, Opal told Cora to wash the front room curtains. Cora's hands stopped on the table she was wiping. The curtains were pale blue cotton with small white flowers along the hem. Cora's mother had sewn them in the year before she died. They were the last thing in the house that still carried the trace of her parents. If Cora pressed her face into the fabric and breathed deeply enough, she could still find faintly the smell of the lavender water her mother used when she pressed linens. Everything else in this house that had belonged to Cora's parents had been absorbed into Aldous' household so completely that its origins had been erased. The furniture, the dishes, the quilt on the bed that Aldous now shared with Opal. All of it had become Aldous' through the simple physics of proximity and silence. But the curtains were still her mother's. The curtains still smelled like home. No, Cora said, not loud, not angry. A single quiet syllable from a girl who had said yes to everything for 7 years and who had found in this one small thing the line she could not cross. Opal's face did not change. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but her mouth stayed the same. And that steadiness was more dangerous than anger, because it meant Opal had been expecting this. Opal had been waiting for Cora to refuse something, anything, so that the next step in Opal's plan could proceed. She called for Aldous. Aldous came to the kitchen doorway. He did not step into the kitchen. He stood on the threshold with one foot on the kitchen floor and one foot in the hallway. And Cora noticed this the way she had learned to notice everything about Aldous in 7 years of study. He always stood on thresholds. He always positioned himself between rooms, half committed to one and half committed to the other. It was where he had been standing for Cora's entire childhood. Not quite present, not quite gone, occupying the exact midpoint between duty and indifference. If you won't listen to her, Aldous said, then go. Flat, quiet, no anger. The voice of a man who had made this decision weeks or months or years ago and had simply been waiting for the moment to arrive. The way a trapper checks his snare each morning, knowing that the animal will come eventually. The question was never whether Cora would leave. The question was when, and what excuse would make it look like her choice rather than his. Opal stood behind Aldous with her arms crossed and her mouth set. She said nothing. She did not need to. The architecture of this moment had been built by Opal over 4 months of careful pressure. 4 months of small demands and smaller provocations. Each one designed to push Cora a half step closer to the refusal that would justify the eviction that Opal had wanted since her first night in this house. And now the refusal had come, and Opal watched it land with the satisfaction of a person watching a plan complete itself. But before Cora reached the door, Opal added one more sentence. She said it to Aldous, not to Cora, but loud enough that Cora heard every word, and the overhearing was the purpose. Thank God, I cannot stand the girl looking at me with her mother's eyes for one more day. Cora stopped. Her hand was on the doorframe. Morning light came through the kitchen window and fell across Opal's face. And in that light, Cora could see that Opal was not angry. Opal was relieved. And the relief was not simply about getting rid of a girl who would not wash curtains. The relief was deeper and stranger than that. Her mother's eyes. Opal was afraid of Cora's resemblance to her mother. And the thing Opal was afraid of was the thing she could not say directly. The thing that lived in the space between the words rather than in the words themselves. The way Aldous sometimes looked at Cora, not often, not obviously, but sometimes when Cora moved through the kitchen or stood at the woodpile or sat at the table reading by lamplight, something crossed Aldous' face that was not the way an uncle looks at a niece. Opal had seen it. Opal could not name it, but Opal could remove it from her house by removing the girl who caused it. Aldous did not turn around. He did not deny what Opal had said. His back was to Cora, and his face was to the hallway, and his silence filled the kitchen with a pressure that was worse than any word he could have spoken. Because at least a word could be argued with. You cannot argue with a man's back. Cora asked for her mother's coat. The brown wool coat with the torn lining that her mother had worn every winter. The coat that still fit Cora because she was built the way her mother had been built. Tall and narrow through the shoulders. It was the one thing in this house that Cora considered hers beyond dispute. Everything under this roof is mine, Aldous said, still facing the hallway, still showing her his back. Cora looked past him at Opal. Opal was wearing Cora's mother's apron, the one with small blue flowers on the pocket. She was wearing it the way a flag is flown over captured ground. Cora left with a flour sack containing 2 changes of clothes, a skinning knife, a box of matches, a ball of twine, and a tin pot with a dented rim and a handle worn smooth by 20 years of use. The pot had been her mother's. It was old and dented and made of cheap tin and worth nothing by any measure that Aldous Hollister would recognize, which is why it was the only thing of her mother's that had survived 7 years in his house. The things we overlook are sometimes the only things that endure. She walked out the front door into September sunlight. The sky was high and blue and empty. To the left, the road went downhill toward Ridgeway, toward the post office and the general store and the church where Aldous sat in the third pew every Sunday with his hand on Opal's arm and his face arranged in the expression of a man who has done right by his obligations. To the right, the road went uphill toward Tabletop Mountain, climbing through scrub oak and aspen that were just starting to turn gold at their tips. Cora went right. She went up because down was Ridgeway, and Ridgeway was Aldous' world. Ridgeway was the town that had watched Aldous keep his dead brother's daughter for 7 years, without warmth, without acknowledgement, without ever speaking her name, and had decided collectively and without discussion that this was not their concern. Every community has a distance it maintains between knowing and doing. In Ridgeway, that distance was wide enough to lose a girl in. That afternoon, Aldous told his neighbor that Cora had gone to Denver to find work. He told the postmaster the same thing. He told the minister on Sunday. The lie was simple and clean, and it required nothing of anyone who heard it. A girl gone to Denver was a girl who had made a choice, and choices belong to the people who make them. And no one in Ridgeway needed to wonder whether the choice had been made for her. This was the first lie. It would not be the last. The mine road was overgrown but passable. 2 ruts worn into the mountainside by ore wagons that had not rolled in 12 years. Grass and fireweed grew between the ruts. Young aspen pushed up through the packed dirt. And Cora walked through it all with the long stride of a tall woman who was carrying everything she owned in one hand and who was walking away from the only home she had ever known and toward the only direction that was not backward. She reached the mine site in the middle of the afternoon. The Consolidated Copper Company had pulled out of Tabletop Mountain in 1876, 12 years earlier, when the main vertical shaft hit an underground aquifer at the 200-foot level and flooded beyond the capacity of the pumps. The company abandoned 3 horizontal drift tunnels cut into the south face of the mountain, a leaning head frame over the drowned shaft, a roofless, crushing mill, and a handful of surface buildings, a stone powder magazine, a tool shed missing half its roof, an assay office with empty window frames, a cookhouse that had been stripped of every movable object and left to settle into its own foundation like a body settling into a grave. The mountain had spent 12 years taking it all back. Timber graying, roofs collapsing, the vertical shaft filled with water so black and so motionless that it did not look like water at all, but like an opening into somewhere deeper and darker than the mountain itself. Cora stood among the ruins and looked at the mouth of drift number 1, 6 feet wide, 7 feet tall, framed with Douglas fir timbers that had turned the color of old bone. Beyond the frame, nothing. Darkness so complete it seemed solid. She felt nothing about it. Not fear, which would have meant she still had something to protect. Not hope, which would have meant she still expected something from the world. She felt the recognition of a practical fact. A hole in a mountain is at minimum a roof, and a roof was more than Aldous had given her. She stepped inside. Drift number 1 ran straight into the mountain for 80 feet. The air cooled as she walked, dropping degree by degree from the September warmth outside into something steadier and older. The timber supports lining the walls were gray with age but hard to the touch, preserved by the dry mountain air that had pulled moisture from the wood grain the way a smokehouse cures meat, leaving behind a structure that would outlast most buildings on the surface. At the end of the drift, the tunnel intersected a crosscut that ran left and right along the copper vein. A drift follows the ore. A crosscut cuts across it. A stope is the chamber left behind when the ore has been removed. These are the rooms of a mine, and they were about to become the rooms of Cora Hollister's home. She turned right. The crosscut ran south for 40 feet and opened into a stope, a mined-out chamber 20 feet wide, 15 feet deep, and 12 feet tall. The temperature here held at a constant 54 degrees Fahrenheit, maintained by the thermal mass of the surrounding stone. Millions of tons of rock absorb heat with such slowness and release it with such reluctance that the temperature inside a mountain does not change with the seasons. It does not change with the centuries. The mountain holds 54 degrees the way a bell holds its note long after the striking has stopped. Cora struck a match. The walls lit up. Dark gray schist veined with copper oxide, malachite green and azurite blue, catching the small flame and reflecting it back in threads and flashes of color that jumped as the match trembled in her hand. The ceiling was solid, a pillar of unmined ore left in place to bear the weight above. The floor at one end had been backfilled with waste rock during the mining operation, creating a raised platform roughly 6 feet by 8, flat and dry. And on the platform, half buried in the dust of 12 years, Cora saw something. She knelt. She brushed the dust away with her fingertips. A bone button. Round, flat, hand-carved with 2 holes for thread, and 2 letters scratched into the back. J.P. Someone had been here before her. Someone had lain on this platform and lost a button from a shirt or a coat and had not found it, or had not bothered to find it because they were leaving and the button did not matter enough to search for. Someone whose name started with J and ended with P had spent time in this chamber, alone in the dark, and had left behind this one small proof of their existence. Cora picked up the button. She held it in her palm. It weighed almost nothing. She set it back on the platform exactly where she had found it. She did not keep it. She did not throw it away. She left it where it was, because this place had belonged to someone before her. And the only appropriate response to the belongings of the absent is to leave them undisturbed. Cora understood this because she had spent 7 years watching her own mother's belongings absorbed and erased by someone who considered them his. And she would not do to a stranger what Aldous had done to her mother. The match burned to her fingers. She let the dark return. That night, Cora lay on the stone platform in the stope, and the darkness closed over her like deep water. Not the darkness of a bedroom with the lamp turned out, not the darkness of a cellar or a moonless night, the darkness of the deep earth, a blackness so total it had weight and texture, pressing against her open eyes as though the mountain were resting a hand on her face. She could see nothing. She could see less than nothing. Her eyes were open and receiving no information at all, and the absence of information became its own kind of sensation, a presence rather than an absence, as though darkness at this depth were not the lack of something, but the abundance of something else. She heard water somewhere deep in the mountain, a drip, steady and metronomic, one drop every 4 or 5 seconds falling from stone onto stone, with a clean, small sound that came from every direction at once. She heard the rocks shift, tiny pops and ticks. The sounds of geological adjustment on a timescale that made human life a rounding error. The mountain settling, the mountain holding its shape against gravity and time. And in that darkness, lying on a stone bed, in a room carved out of a mountain by men she had never met, Cora Hollister did something she had not done in 7 years. She cried. She had not cried in Aldous' house. Not once. Because crying where Aldous could hear would have been proof that he had the power to hurt her. And Cora had decided at 11 years old, with the instinct of a child who grasped the mechanics of power before she could spell the word, that she would never give Aldous that proof. She would cook and clean and split and haul and scrub and endure, and she would do all of it with dry eyes and a still face. because her composure was the only thing in that house that belonged entirely to her, and that Aldous could not take. But here in the dark, in the belly of a mountain where no one could see and no one would ever know, she let go. She cried not because she was afraid of the dark or the cold or the aloneness. She cried because she was relieved, because for the first time in 7 years, there was no one to perform for, no one to resist, no one whose indifference she had to meet with a mask of equal indifference. She was alone, truly alone, and the aloneness was not punishment. It was the first honest thing that had happened to her since her parents died. The crying lasted until it was finished. Cora sat up in the blackness and struck another match and watched the malachite and azurite catch the flame and throw green and blue across the chamber walls. And the colors were beautiful, and this was the first beautiful thing she had seen in 7 years that she was not required to clean or maintain or surrender. The match burned out. She lay down. She did not sleep, but she rested. And resting in a place where no one could find her was close enough to sleep to carry her through the night. The first month was survival stripped to its essentials. She built her cook fire at the drift mouth where the smoke could escape into open air. She heated creek stones in the barn and carried them into the stove wrapped in canvas she had torn from the cookhouse wreckage, placing them around the sleeping platform where they radiated warmth for hours into the 54-degree air. She narrowed the drift entrance from 6 feet to 3, stacking waste rock on either side and fitting salvage planks into a door frame braced with log sections sunk into the floor. She twisted copper wire from the waste piles into a handle and threaded it through a hole she burned in the plank with a heated nail. From outside, the entrance looked like a natural collapse, a closed tunnel that a person walking the mine road would pass without a second thought. From inside, it was a door, and the door changed everything. Because a door is the line between exposed and sheltered, between found and hidden, between a place where the world can reach you and a place where the world requires your permission to enter. Cora had never had a door with a lock in Aldis's house. The storeroom had no lock. Her life had no lock. Now she had a door that she had built herself, and behind it a room that she had chosen herself. And the choosing was the thing that mattered more than the room. In the third week, 2 men on horseback rode into the mine yard. Cora was fitting the last plank into the doorframe when she heard the hooves. She pulled the unfinished door closed, crawled behind the waste rock pile inside the drift, and pressed her eye to the gap between 2 planks. 2 riders. One dismounted at the head frame and walked around the flooded shaft looking up at the timber with the bored competence of a man assessing salvage value. The second rider stayed mounted. He wore a dark wool coat, good quality, well fitted. He held a leather notebook in his left hand. He scanned the south face of the mountain, his gaze moving across the drift entrances one by one. And when his gaze reached drift number 1, it stopped. He looked at the narrowed opening. He looked at the new planks among the old stone. He opened his notebook and wrote something. He looked for another 10 seconds. Then he turned his horse, and both men rode back down the mine road without speaking. Cora stayed behind the waste rock for an hour after the hoofbeats faded. Her pulse was knocking in her ears. She did not know who the man in the good coat was. She did not know what he had written in his notebook. She knew only that he had looked at her door for 10 seconds, and that 10 seconds of attention from a stranger with a notebook could undo everything she was building. She finished the door that night. She made it look less like construction and more like collapse. She scattered loose rock across the approach and dragged a dead branch over the entrance and stood back in the failing light and examined her work and decided it would hold. Not forever, but long enough. The second month brought discovery. The left-hand crosscut, the one she had not yet explored, led to a second stope. Smaller, 10 by 12 feet with a lower ceiling, but with something the first stope did not have. A natural fracture in the wall, no wider than a finger. That admitted a thin blade of daylight from the surface. Cora widened the crack carefully over the course of 3 days, working with a salvaged mining pick, testing each stroke to make sure she was not weakening the wall beyond safety. When she was finished, the crack threw a column of light 2 inches wide that moved slowly across the chamber floor as the sun crossed the sky overhead. It reached the east wall by late afternoon and faded as the sun dropped below the ridge. A sundial, a calendar, a daily proof that the world above still turned. She organized the space. The first stope became the living quarters. The second became the workshop and pantry. She strung twine between the two chambers through the crosscut and hung canvas curtains at each end, dividing the underground into rooms that could be sealed individually, each one holding its own warmth behind fabric walls. She built a sleeping platform from mined timber, a table from cookhouse lumber, a stool from a log section, and shelves that she wedged into natural cracks in the rock face. She found a fissure in the ceiling of the first stope that drew air upward through the rock to some unseen exit on the mountainside above, and she built a fire pit beneath it. The smoke rose into the crack and vanished. The air stayed clean. The food came from the mountain. She set wire snares on game trails for rabbits and squirrels. She bent a nail into a hook and fished the creek. She gathered wild onions, dandelion greens, choke cherries, service berries, rose hips, and the starchy roots of biscuit, root, and yampa from the meadows above the mine. She dried everything: meat on racks near the cook fire, berries spread on flat stones in the second stope and turned daily until they were leathery and dark, roots braided together and hung from ceiling pegs. All of it stored in the constant cool of the underground, where 54 degrees and absolute darkness prevented spoilage better than any icehouse in Ridgeway. By the end of November, Cora had assembled a pantry that would have impressed any farm wife in the county. Rows of dried meat on a shelf she had chiseled into the rock face, braided root strings hanging from timber pegs, berries dried flat on stones, crocks of rendered fat sealed with cheesecloth scraps in the coldest corner where the temperature dropped to 53. Enough food to carry her through to April. On the 14th of November, the first real snow came, 2 feet on the upper slopes. The mine road vanished under drifts that would not melt for 5 months. The world above turned white and foreign and locked. Cora stood at the daylight crack in the second stope and watched the column of light narrow as snow accumulated over the opening on the surface. The beam thinned from a blade to a thread to a faint gray whisper. And in the last moment before the snow sealed the crack entirely in that final sliver of light from the world outside, Cora saw something through the narrow gap that stopped her breathing. A figure, standing on the mine road below. Not moving, not passing through, standing still, facing uphill, looking at the south face of the mountain. Looking toward the drift entrance, the figure was not large, not the shape of a man, wrapped in a dark coat, standing very still in the falling snow, looking up at the mountain with an intensity that Cora could feel even through 2 inches of fractured rock. The snow covered the crack. The light died. The figure vanished. Cora stood in the dark with the mining pick in one hand and the skinning knife in the other. And she listened to the silence of the mountain, and she waited for the sound of footsteps in the drift, for knocking on the plank door, for any indication that the figure on the road had found what it was looking for. Nothing came. The snow kept falling. The mountain held its silence. But Cora did not sleep that night. She sat on the platform with the knife across her knees and the tin pot beside her and the bone button marked JP on the stone where she had left it. And she watched the darkness. And she listened. And she understood something new. Surviving alone in a mountain was not the hardest part. The hardest part was not knowing whether the world outside had lost interest in her or was closing in, and not knowing which possibility she feared more. The creek froze solid on the 12th of December, and by midnight, Cora Hollister was out of water. She had been rationing for 3 days, melting handfuls of snow over the fire pit stones. But the snow on the upper slopes was so dry and fine that a full pot of it melted down to barely 2 inches of water. And 2 inches of water is not enough when your body is burning fuel to stay warm, and your stored food requires soaking before it can be eaten. And the nearest liquid that is not frozen is somewhere beneath 3 inches of creek ice 50 yards down a slope that is covered in knee-deep drifts. And the temperature outside is 15 degrees below zero. She went out at midnight because waiting until morning was not an option. She pushed through the plank door into air that hit her lungs like a swallowed knife. The wool jacket she had walked out of Aldous' house wearing was the only coat she owned. It was not enough. Nothing she had was enough for this. She carried the mining pick in one hand and the tin pot in the other, and she half walked and half fell down the slope to the creek bank, breaking through the crust with every step, the snow collapsing around her thighs. The effort of extracting each leg so enormous that by the time she reached the creek, She was breathing in gasps that froze in the air before they left her mouth. She swung the pick. The ice cracked on the third stroke. Black water moved sluggishly beneath it. Barely a current, but liquid. She filled the pot. She reached to steady herself on the bank, and the pot slipped from fingers she could no longer feel. It hit a rock. The water poured out across the ice and vanished into the crack she had just made. Cora knelt on the frozen creek bank with empty hands and an empty pot, and she felt something ignite in her chest that was not grief and not fear. It was rage. Specific, directed, hot enough to register as a physical sensation even as the rest of her body shut down from cold. She was furious at Aldous for putting her in a position where a frozen creek could kill her. She was furious at herself for choosing a mountain over a train ticket. She was furious at the creek and the cold and the night and the absolute indifference of every element of the natural world to whether Cora Hollister lived or died on this bank at this hour. But the hottest point of the fury, the core of it, was this. She knew that if she could go back to the morning of September the 3rd and stand in Aldous' kitchen and hear him say, "Then go," she would go again. Up, not down, mountain, not Denver. Every time, even now, kneeling on ice with dead hands and no water, and the nearest warm body miles away in every direction. She would choose this. And being furious at your own stubbornness, while simultaneously recognizing that your stubbornness is the only thing keeping you alive, is a particular kind of anger that does not weaken you. It straightens your spine. It puts your feet under you. It picks up the pot. She filled it again. She climbed the slope. She made it through the door. She sat against the stope wall with the pot between her knees and her hands pressed against her stomach under the jacket until the blood returned. And the blood returning was pain of a kind that she registered as information rather than suffering. Pain meant alive. Pain meant the hands still worked. Pain was the body's way of insisting on itself. She melted snow over the fire pit for the rest of the winter. She did not return to the creek until the thaw. But winter taught her something beyond survival. It taught her that 3 months of doing nothing except staying alive had begun to flatten her into a single function. She woke, she ate, she maintained the fire, she checked the snares, she slept. The days were identical, the routine was necessary, and the routine was killing something inside her that was harder to name than hunger or cold. She was becoming an instrument of her own continuation, a tool whose only purpose was to not break. And Cora could feel the narrowing happening, could feel her thoughts shrinking to fit the same small circuit of tasks. And she understood that this was its own kind of danger. A life organized entirely around not dying is a life that has already conceded something essential. She needed to make things, not useful things, not snares or shelves or door repairs, things that served no survival function at all, things that existed only because she had decided they should exist, shaped by her hands into forms she had chosen rather than forms that necessity demanded. Because choosing the shape of something when no one requires you to choose is the difference between a person and a mechanism. And Cora was not willing to become a mechanism, not for Aldous, not for winter, not for the mountain. The assay office solved the problem. It was the smallest of the surface buildings. A stone-walled room about 10 feet square with a collapsed roof and a door frozen half open on corroded hinges. Inside, bolted to a stone slab that served as a workbench, Cora found a crucible furnace. A fire brick chamber, roughly 18 inches on each side with a bellows port on the left. A flue hole on top and a small door in front that opened onto a firing space just large enough to hold a clay crucible. The apparatus weighed close to 200 pounds, which was why the salvage crews had left it. Heavy things survive abandonment. Heavy things get left behind. Cora was beginning to understand this principle personally. She spent 2 weeks dismantling the furnace and carrying it underground piece by piece. 23 trips through the drift, each one carrying a single fire brick or a section of bellows pipe or the iron frame that cradled the crucible. She rebuilt it in the second stope against the wall near the daylight crack where the fracture provided ventilation. The bellows she reconstructed from salvaged leather and a wooden frame. The crucible she found in the debris. Cracked along one side but functional if she packed the crack with a paste of wet ash and clay. The tunnel walls held the raw material. Malachite, the green copper carbonate mineral that streaked the schist in veins she had first seen by matchlight on her first night. To extract pure copper from malachite, the mineral must be heated above 1100 degrees Fahrenheit in a reducing atmosphere, meaning an enclosed fire fed by forced air from a bellows but starved of enough oxygen to burn completely. The incomplete combustion produces carbon monoxide, which bonds with the oxygen in the copper carbonate and carries it away as gas, leaving behind pure metallic copper that pools as a molten bead at the bottom of the crucible. The slag, everything that is not copper, rises to the surface and can be poured off. Cora did not know the chemistry. She knew that miners had used this furnace to test ore, and that the green rock on the walls was the ore, and that the furnace was the bridge between rock and metal. The gap between knowing that and doing it turned out to be filled with failure. The first three attempts produced slag and frustration. The bellows port clogged twice with mineral dust. The temperature would not climb high enough, or the crucible leaked, or the fuel was too wet, or the airflow was wrong. And each failure left Cora sitting on the stove floor, the black fingernails and soot on her face, and nothing to show for hours of pumping the bellows until her shoulders burned. The fourth attempt was the worst. She had repaired the crucible crack with fresh paste and loaded a full charge of malachite and found a rhythm on the bellows that she could sustain. The temperature climbed. The malachite began to hiss and pop inside the sealed furnace. And then the crucible split along a new fault line, and a spray of molten material shot through the gap. And a single drop smaller than a P 1000 degrees landed on her left forearm between the wrist and the elbow. The pain was not a feeling, it was an event, a detonation of nerve endings so total and so immediate that Cora's vision whited out for a full second. She jerked her arm back, and the drop fell away. But the skin beneath it was already destroyed, a white blister rising on a red field, and beneath the blister, the tissue was cooked. She clamped her teeth on the collar of her jacket and held the sound inside, because screaming into empty stone was something she could not allow. Not because anyone would hear, because she was afraid that if she screamed here alone, with no one to answer, the sound would come back to her from the walls, and she would hear in its echo exactly how alone she was. And hearing that would be worse than the burn. She treated the wound with cold water and a strip of cloth torn from the hem of her jacket. She sat in the first stove with her arm pressed against the cool wall and the pain throbbing with her heartbeat. And she thought about her mother. Not her mother's hands this time. Her mother's voice, the low, steady voice that had walked Cora through every childhood injury with the same words. You're all right. It looks worse than it is. Hold still. 3 sentences. Simple. Ordinary. And there was no one in this mountain or on this mountain or anywhere within the radius of Cora's existence who would say them to her now. The burn scarred, a white ridge of tissue running from wrist to elbow that she would carry for the rest of her life. She did not hide it. She did not cover it. It was the pace of the 5th attempt. And the 5th attempt was the one that changed everything. New crucible, smaller but intact. Dried fuel cured for a week on the warm stones near the fire pit. Repaired bellows port lined with a copper sleeve she had hammered from a piece of native copper to keep the dust out. And a rhythm on the bellows that she had calibrated through 4 failures. A stroke every 2 seconds. Steady, sustainable. The kind of rhythm that you find not through instruction, but through the accumulated knowledge of what does not work. She pumped for 30 minutes. The furnace roared in the enclosed chamber, the sound bouncing off the stove walls and filling the space with a vibration she could feel in her molars. Inside the crucible, she could hear something changing, a liquid sound beneath the roar, the sound of solid becoming fluid. She opened the furnace door. She gripped the crucible with tongs fashioned from an iron bar. She tilted it over the flat stone she used as a work surface. Slag poured out, dark and glassy and worthless. And then beneath the slag, rolling slowly across the stone, a bead of copper the size of a marble. Orange, glowing, pure. It sat on the stone and pulsed with its own heat. And the color of it in the gray chamber was so vivid and so warm that it looked like it belonged to a different world than the one it had been extracted from. As though Cora had reached into the bones of the mountain and pulled out a piece of trapped sunlight. She picked it up with the tongs. She set it on the flat stone she used as an anvil. She struck it with the rock hammer. The bead flattened into a disc. Bright, smooth, warm. She could see a warped reflection of the daylight beam in its surface. She struck it again. thinner. And Cora laughed, a short, rough sound that came out of her throat before she could shape it, a sound that did not know whether it was joy or defiance or relief. And so it was all three at once, raw and unfinished. The laugh of a bird who has been silent for so long that even happiness arrives without polish. She collected malachite and native copper from the walls and waste piles. She smelted small batches, hammered ingots into shapes, hooks for the stope walls, hinges for a storage cabinet, a ladle, a second pot, rivets for the bellows when the leather stitching gave out, buttons, flat and round with two punched holes, the kind that could replace the bone fasteners on a coat or serve as currency for a woman who had no dollars, and a bracelet, a band of hammered copper no wider than her little finger, curved to fit her left wrist, directly above the burn scar. She made it for no reason that survival could explain. She made it because making something beautiful inside a mountain was a refusal to be reduced to function. She made it because adornment is the oldest human protest against the idea that staying alive is enough. She wore it from that day forward. She never took it off. Spring brought Cora out of the mountain and into a transaction that would change the shape of her solitude. She cleared a garden on the south-facing slope below the mine entrance, picking stones from the rocky soil one by one, working the dirt with a flat piece of timber until it was loose enough to accept seed. She dug a shallow irrigation trench from the creek to a point above the garden, lining it with flat stones and running it along the slope's contour so that gravity fed water into the beds. She planted potatoes, beans, turnips, and onions from seeds she acquired at a ranch 5 miles south. Paying with copper buttons, the rancher asked no questions. The rancher's wife did. Dorothea Pruitt was 42 years old, a widow running a 200-acre cattle ranch alone since her husband died of pneumonia 3 years earlier. She had a square face and hands that had dug more post holes than most men in the county, and a manner of speaking that treated extra words the way she treated weeds, something to be pulled out and discarded. She looked at the copper buttons laid on her kitchen table, and she looked at Cora, and she said nothing for a long moment. The second visit, Cora brought eggs. She had traded for 3 hens at another ranch in August and housed them in a stone pen against the south face near the drift entrance. The hens laid through November. Fresh eggs in the mountains were worth more than buttons, and Dorothea Pruitt accepted them with the first sign of warmth Cora had seen from her, a nod that was almost a smile. The third visit, Dorothea was waiting at the gate. "I know who you are," she said. Cora's weight shifted to her back foot. Instinct. The same instinct that had put a knife in her hand when the knocking came. "That tin pot you carry, I was neighbors with your mother and father in Ridgeway before I married Tom and moved out here. Your mother stewed plums in that pot every August. I watched her do it from my kitchen window. I would know that pot if I saw it in a pile of 1,000 pots." Cora said nothing. The eggs in her basket were still warm from the hens. "Come inside," Dorothea said. "There is something you need to hear." They sat at Dorothea's kitchen table. Dorothea poured tea. The kitchen smelled of bread and wood smoke and soap, and these smells hit Cora with a force she had not anticipated. The smells of a functioning household, of a woman's house. It had been over a year since she had sat inside any house at all. The sensation was disorienting. The normalcy of it was disorienting. Dorothea set her cup down. "Aldous told Ridgeway you went to Denver last September. That was the first lie." She paused. "2 months ago, he told the county you are dead. Fever, he said, in Denver last winter. He filed a declaration of death with the county clerk." The kitchen clock ticked. A horse stamped in the corral outside. The bread cooled on the rack. Cora sat at the table with both hands flat on the wood, the one with the burn scar and the one without, and she pressed her fingers into the grain until the tips went white, because pressing was the only way to keep her hands from shaking. And keeping her hands still was the only way to keep the thing rising in her chest from reaching her face. Not grief, not surprise. Something colder than both. She had known Aldous was capable of discarding her. She had not known he was capable of erasing her. First she was gone, then she was dead. 2 lies, each one sealing the previous one shut, each one making the reversal harder and the silence more permanent. "Why?" Cora said. Dorothea shook her head. "I cannot say for certain." But Opal has been talking at church. She told Mrs. Felton that Aldous finally settled his brother's affairs. Your father's affairs, she meant. The paperwork, the money, the envelope that had arrived with Cora at Aldis's door when she was 11. The savings her father had designated for Cora when she turned 18. She had turned 18 in June of 1888. Aldous had put her out in September. He had told the county she was dead the following winter. He had collected the money sometime after. $190. Not a fortune, but a year's food for a family, or 6 months' wages for a ranch hand, or a train ticket to anywhere in the country. Aldous had taken it with the same methodical patience he applied to everything. No raised voice, no violence, just paper and silence, and the steady, confident assumption that the world would believe him because the world always had. Cora understood now, understood fully. The morning of September the 3rd had not been a reaction to her refusal to wash the curtains. It had been the execution of a plan. Aldous had been waiting for an excuse. Any excuse. Something that would make her departure look like her choice rather than his. And once she was gone, he had waited a respectable interval. And then he had killed her on paper. Because a dead niece cannot come back to claim her inheritance. And a living niece who has vanished into the mountains cannot prove she is alive to anyone who matters. Not indifference. Calculation. From the very beginning. The sentence, "Then go," had been prepared long before Cora refused to wash the curtains. The only question was when, and what pretext would make it look clean. "What do you want to do?" Dorothea asked. Her voice was level. Her eyes were direct. She was not offering sympathy. She was asking a question the way one working adult must ask another. "I don't know yet," Cora said. "When you do," Dorothea said, "come tell me." Cora carried the information back to the mountain. It sat inside her beside the rage that had pulled her off the frozen creek bank. But it was a different temperature. The creek rage had been hot, a flash fire in the chest, something that burned fast and left resolve in its ashes. This was cold. This was the slow understanding that Aldous had not simply failed her through indifference. Aldous had actively, deliberately, methodically destroyed her legal existence in order to steal what her father had left her. The indifference had been a mask. Beneath it was calculation. Josiah Holt arrived on a Tuesday in February. He was 61 years old and thin enough that the wind seemed to pass through him rather than around him. White beard, blue eyes, hands that had held a rock hammer for 40 years and that bore the permanent calluses of a man whose profession is patience. He had been panning for placer gold in the creek below Tabletop when he saw smoke rising from a fissure on the mountainside above the lowest drift. Smoke where there should be no smoke. He climbed the mine road. He found the entrance. He studied the plank door with its copper wire handle. He knocked 3 times. This is the moment where we began. Cora behind the door with the knife. The silence between the knocks. The calculation. But this time we hear what happens next. A voice through the door, rough from months of disuse. "Who is there?" "Looking for gold," said the voice outside. "No gold in this mountain," said the voice on me saying. "There is copper." She opened the door, because the man on the other side was old and carried nothing but a rock hammer. And because his eyes, when the door swung inward and the firelight from the stope reached his face, held curiosity rather than calculation. Cora had spent 7 years learning to read the difference. Curiosity asks, calculation takes. Josiah walked through the drift, past the curtain, into the first stope. He stood in the center of the chamber and turned slowly. His eyes moving from the sleeping platform to the table, to the shelves, to the fire pit, to the copper hooks on the walls, to the second stope, visible through the crosscut where the forge glowed and the daylight beam cut its bright line across the floor. He turned the way a man turns inside a cathedral, not because the space is large, but because it demands attention. "How long?" he asked. 11 months. "Loan?" "Yes." He sat on the stool and drank coffee brewed over the forge fire and looked at the copper ladle hanging from a copper hook on the schist wall. "Your uncle told everyone you went to Denver. I know you didn't." "No." Josiah did not tell Aldous. He did not tell Ridgway. He left the mountain that afternoon and he told no one what he had found, because Josiah Holt had spent 40 years alone in mountains. And he understood something that most people do not understand about solitude. Some people disappear because they are lost. Some people disappear because they have finally found the only place where the world makes sense. And telling the world where those people are is not a rescue, it is a violation. He came back 2 weeks later with flour and coffee and salt in a wool coat that Cora put on that evening and wore for the next 3 years. He did not ask for payment. Cora gave him copper buttons, which he sold in Montrose without naming their maker. On his third visit, Cora asked why he kept coming. Josiah sat on the stool with the coffee cup between his palms, and he was quiet for longer than Cora had ever heard another person be quiet inside her stove. The fire ticked. The daylight beam moved a fraction of an inch across the second stove floor. "I had a daughter," he said. "Her name was Bess. She died of fever when she was 15. If she had lived, she would be your age." Cora set down her own cup. She looked at the old man on the stool, and she saw something she had not expected to see. Not kindness. She had already seen his kindness. What she saw now was the engine behind the kindness, the furnace that powered it, and the furnace was grief. Josiah helped Cora not because Cora needed help, but because Cora was alive and Bess was not. And helping Cora was the closest Josiah could get to the daughter he had not been able to save. Cora picked up the pot and poured more coffee into his cup. It was a small gesture, the kind of thing a person does automatically when hosting a guest. But for Cora, it was the first time in over a year that she had served someone not because she was required to, but because she wanted to. The difference between compelled service and chosen service is invisible to the eye and infinite to the spirit. She had spent 7 years pouring things for Aldous. She had never once chosen to. But the knowledge of Bess also lodged itself in a place that would cause trouble later. Because if Josiah saw Bess when he looked at Cora, then he did not see Cora. And Cora had spent 7 years being unseen in Aldous' house. And she would not spend the rest of her life being unseen in Josiah's grief. Summer of 1889, June the 15th, Cora's 20th birthday. She spent it alone. She had not told Josiah the date. She had not told anyone. There was no one to tell. She sat in the first stove after the fire burned low and the forge cooled and the daylight faded from the crack and the mountain settled into its nightly silence. 20 years old, 1 year in the mine. No one on the surface of the earth knew what day it was for her. No one was thinking of her. No one was marking the passage of her years. And for the first time since she had entered the mountain, Cora felt something worse than cold or hunger or fear. She felt the full weight of what she had chosen. Freedom without witness. Independence without recognition. She had built a home and a forge and a garden and a pantry, and she had done it alone. And no one knew, and no one would ever know unless she told them. And she was not sure anymore that not telling was strength. Maybe not telling was just another kind of invisibility. Maybe she had escaped Aldous' house only to replicate its central condition, the condition of existing without being seen. She sat with this for a long time. The mountain offered no answer. The mountain offered the same thing it always offered: constancy without commentary. When Josiah came the following week, Cora was colder than usual. Not angry, distant. Josiah noticed. He asked if something was wrong. Cora said nothing. And Josiah, with the instinct of a man who had loved a daughter he could not stop seeing in every young woman he met, said, "Bess used to say nothing when she was sad too." The words landed in the stove with the weight of a struck anvil. "I am not Bess," Cora said. Her voice was level, but the temperature of it was not. "And you are not my father." Josiah set down his cup. He stood. He walked to the door. He opened it. He left without finishing his coffee. The stove after his departure was the same size it had always been, but it felt larger, the way a room feels larger when the person who filled it is gone. Cora did not call after him. She did not regret what she had said, because it was true, and because truth was the only thing she owned that could not be taken from her. But the silence that settled into the stove after the door closed was not the comfortable silence of solitude. It was the brittle silence of a severed connection. And it hurt in a way that surprised her, because she had not realized until it was gone how much Josiah's visits had meant. Not the flour and the coffee, the presence, the human weight of another person in the room. 2 weeks passed. Cora worked the forge. She expanded the garden. She preserved the summer surplus. She did not go to the creek to look for Josiah. She did not walk down the mine road. She waited, and the waiting was its own kind of answer, because a person who waits is a person who hopes. And Cora was not ready to admit that she hoped. He came back on a Tuesday. He did not apologize. He set a book on the table. Walt Whitman, Leaves of Grass. He sat on the stool and looked at Cora and said, "I know you are not Bess. That is exactly why I came back. Because Bess did not need me. But you might." Cora looked at the book. She looked at Josiah. "I do not need anyone." She picked up the book. She read it that evening in the daylight beam until the sun moved past the crack and the words dissolved into shadow. And she understood why Josiah had brought it. Not because the poems were beautiful, because the poems were about being alone and being seen at the same time, about containing multitudes, about the self as its own witness. Whitman had written for people like her, people who had no one to tell them who they were, and who had to decide for themselves. Through the rest of 1889 and into 1890, Cora expanded the mine into something that Josiah, who had seen shelters in every mountain range from the San Juans to the Bitterroots, described without exaggeration as the most remarkable home he had ever entered. A third chamber accessed by a ladder through a raised opening. Walls lined with polished copper sheets that bounced the daylight beam onto soil beds where lettuce and herbs grew through winter. Hot water piped through copper tubing coiled around the forge chimney. Split plank walls in the living quarters hung with dried herbs and copper ornaments that caught the firelight and scattered it in points of amber and green across every surface. Josiah came every 2 weeks with supplies. Cora gave him copper goods he sold in Montrose. The arrangement had the quiet rhythm of a partnership that neither of them named. Then on a warm afternoon in August of 1890, horses climbed the mine road. Cora was in the garden when she heard them. She left the hoe where it stood and moved uphill into the timber where she could see the mine yard through the trees. 3 riders. 2 she did not recognize. The third she did. The dark wool coat, the leather notebook. The man she had watched through the plank gaps nearly 2 years ago. He was older than she had guessed from that distance, about 50, clean-shaven, the posture of an employer. Cornelius Drake. She did not yet know his name. She knew his type. Men with notebooks and good coats did not ride up abandoned mine roads for exercise. The 3 men dismounted and entered drift number 1. Cora watched them disappear into the entrance, and she could not breathe. They were inside. They were walking through her home. And the only barrier between their inspection and her exposure was a canvas curtain across a crosscut. She could not reach the stopes ahead of them. She could not hide the forge, the copper hooks, the shelves, the evidence of 2 years of habitation. She crouched in the timber and counted. They were inside for 40 minutes. When they emerged, Drake was writing in his notebook, and one of the other men was talking about timber conditions and stope dimensions. They had gone left into the second stope. They had seen the daylight crack. They had not gone right. They had not pushed past the curtain into the first stope, where the bed and the table and the shelves and the fire pit and the book of Whitman poetry sat in plain view. When Cora finally entered the stope that evening, she found boot prints in the dust of the second chamber. 3 sets. The nearest set was less than 3 feet from the forge, which she had covered with a canvas tarp that morning before going out to the garden. 3 feet. If one of them had pulled back the tarp, if one of them had taken 4 steps to the right instead of turning left. Josiah confirmed what she already knew. The man in the good coat was Cornelius Drake, agent for Mountain Consolidated Mining Company. He was surveying abandoned mines across the district because copper prices were climbing and the company wanted to know which old claims were worth reopening. He had filed for new extraction rights on Tabletop Mountain. And in his filing, he had noted something that made Cora's hands go still when Josiah read it to her from a copy he had obtained in Montrose. Signs of unauthorized entry, possible habitation. Drift number 1 south face. Recommend investigation. Cora stood at the forge. She was holding a copper sheet she had been shaping into a reflector for the herb garden. She did not put it down. She held it between herself and the news the way a person holds a shield. "He will find you," Josiah said, "not this winter, but in the spring when the surveyors come back. He will open every tunnel on this mountain." Cora turned the copper sheet in her hands. The reflected light from the forge moved across the stope walls, across the shelves of dried food, across the Whitman on the bedside shelf, across the bone button marked JP that still sat on the platform where she had placed it on her first night 2 years ago. "Then I will not hide," she said. Josiah looked at her. The fire popped. The copper light moved. "What does that mean?" "It means Aldous made me invisible for 7 years. He declared me dead to make me invisible forever. I will not do his work for him. If Cornelius Drake comes to this mountain, he will find a door, and behind the door he will find me, and I will be standing." The deputy arrived on a Tuesday morning in April of 1891. He rode alone up the mine road on a bay gelding that picked its way through the last patches of snow with the careful steps of a horse that had been ridden by a patient man. Tobias Hadley was 30 years old. He had square hands and a deliberate way of moving that came from 6 years of working underground in the silver mines at Leadville, where moving too fast could collapse a timber set and moving too slow could leave you standing under one when it went. His lungs had started bleeding in the 3rd year. A doctor told him he could keep mining and die in the mountain or stop mining and live above it, and Hadley had chosen to live, which was how he ended up wearing a deputy's badge in a county where the most serious crimes were fence disputes and drunk cattlemen. It was not the life he had planned. It was a life that included breathing, and he had learned not to argue with that view. The county had sent him because a survey crew mapping mineral claims had reported a constructed entrance inside Drift Number 1 on Tabletop Mountain. Someone had built a door where no door should exist. The county needed a man who understood mines to go up and determine what was behind it. Hadley dismounted at the mine yard. He walked to the south face. He studied the entrance to Drift Number 1, the fitted planks, the stacked waste rock, the copper wire handle. He had seen enough mine sites in his career to know what he was looking at. This was not salvage work or casual trespass. This was habitation. He knocked. Footsteps inside. Not the hollow reverberation of boots on bare stone, but the shorter, flatter sound of a person walking across a swept floor toward a door they had been expecting someone to find. The door opened. A young woman stood in the gap, 21 years old, black hair tied back, gray eyes. A copper bracelet on her left wrist and the white ridge of a burn scar running beneath it. She held the door at the width she had held it for Josiah 2 years ago. Wide enough for talk, narrow enough for refusal, the decision still pending. "Deputy Tobias Hadley," he said. "County sent me." "I know why you are here," she said, and she stepped aside. Hadley walked through the drift. He passed the canvas curtain. He entered the first stope, and he stopped walking. And he stood in the center of the chamber, and for a long moment he did not speak. He looked at the split plank walls, the copper hooks holding tools and utensils, the shelves cut into rock bearing rows of preserved food, the fire pit with its clean draw through the ceiling fissure, the forge visible through the crosscut, still warm, its glow coloring the stone walls of the second chamber, the polished copper sheets in the third chamber above, reflecting a beam of daylight onto green beds of lettuce and herbs. The hot water system with its coiled copper tubing. The book on the bedside shelf. Hadley had spent 6 years cutting rock. He knew what it took to shape stone, to set timber, to build anything underground. He understood in his hands and his shoulders and his damaged lungs exactly how much labor was standing around him in this chamber. Every hook, every shelf, every joint and seam represented hours of work performed by a single person with hand tools and salvage material in conditions that would have broken most people he had known in the mines. And most of the people he had known in the mines were grown men working in crews. "How long?" he asked. 3 years. "Alone?" "Mostly." Hadley lowered himself onto the stool. He did not ask for coffee. He did not ask to inspect the other chambers. He sat and he looked at the walls, and he thought about the report he was required to write and the report he wanted to write and the distance between the two. What he was required to write: unauthorized occupant trespassing on mineral claim property. Recommend removal. What he wanted to write: leave her alone. He split the difference. He wrote that he had found the site occupied and that further review was needed before action could be taken. A report that committed to nothing and delayed everything. It was the most he could offer. He was a deputy, not a judge. He could slow the machinery. He could not stop it. The machinery arrived 3 weeks later in the form of Victor Harmon, attorney for Mountain Consolidated Mining Company. He rode up the mine road with two men who did not introduce themselves and who stood behind Harmon in the manner of men whose function is to imply consequence. Harmon was thin and precise, and he read the eviction petition in a voice calibrated to make legal language sound inevitable. Cora Hollister was unlawfully occupying mineral claim property. Mountain Consolidated had filed for extraction rights. Her presence constituted material impediment. She had 30 days to vacate or be removed by the county. Cora stood in the drift entrance. She did not invite them in. She held the door at conversation with, and she listened to every word. And when Harmon finished, she spoke. I have lived here for 3 years. Your company abandoned this mine for 15. You did not want it until I made it worth wanting. Harmon folded the petition. The law does not recognize improvement by trespass, Miss Hollister. Does the law recognize a man declaring his living niece dead so he can collect her inheritance? The sentence changed the air between them, the way a drop beans changes the air in a room full of vapor. Harmon paused with the petition half folded. One of the men behind him looked at the ground. The statement had nothing to do with mining rights or property law or the legal question of who was authorized to occupy Drift Number 1 on Tabletop Mountain. But it had everything to do with the moral question of who Cora Hollister was and why she was standing in this entrance instead of living in a house in Ridgeway. And moral questions, once spoken aloud in front of witnesses, have a way of contaminating legal proceedings, no matter how carefully the lawyers try to keep them out. That is a separate matter, Harmon said. The petition stands. 30 days, he turned. His men turned. They mounted and rode. Cora watched them go. Her hands were trembling against the door frame, but her face was composed. And the composition was not performance. It was practice. 10 years of practice. That evening, Hadley returned with a letter. He rode up the mine road at dusk, and he dismounted with the heaviness of a man carrying something he wished he could put down. The letter was from Aldous. Hadley handed it to Cora in the first stope. He stood among the copper walls and the forge warmth and the smell of dried herbs. And he waited. Because he had been asked to wait for a reply, and because he was, if he admitted it, unable to leave without knowing what the letter said. Cora opened it. 6 lines in handwriting she recognized the way a person recognizes the face of someone they have tried to forget. Small, tight, slanted right, the handwriting of a man who used words the way he used money, as little as possible. Each one counted. Come home, Bull will not mind. There is a room for you. Cora read the 6 lines twice. She read them the way you read the terms of a contract you have already decided to reject. Not for the content, but for what the content reveals about the person who drafted it. Come home, as though she had left by choice, as though the morning of September the 3rd had been a disagreement rather than an expulsion. Opal will not mind, as though Opal's tolerance were the gate Cora needed opened, rather than Aldis's silence and Aldis's theft and Aldis's meticulous erasure of her existence from the public record. There is a room for you, the storeroom. The room with no window and no lock. The room where he had kept her for 7 years without once speaking her name. And the word that Cora noticed most was not in the letter at all. Her name. Aldous had written you. He had not written Cora. 6 lines. A direct address to the niece he had housed for 7 years and declared dead for profit. And he still could not write her name. She folded the letter. She set it on the table beside her mother's tin pot. She looked at Hadley. Tell him I am home. 4 words. Hadley heard them, and he looked at the letter on the table. And then he looked at the stope around him, at the walls and the copper and the shelves and the light, and he understood that the 4 words were not a refusal to return. They were a correction. Cora was not rejecting Aldis's home. She was informing Aldous that the word home had been reassigned. It belonged here now. It had been earned here, in the dark, with burned hands, in a tin pot, in 3 years of work that no one had asked her to do, and no one had helped her complete, and no one had the right to undo. Hadley delivered the message. Aldous did not come. He did not write again. But 30 days was still 30 days, and the petition was still the petition, and Cora needed a lawyer. Josiah rode to Montrose the next morning. He walked into the office of the only attorney in town who took cases that bigger firms turned away. And he placed a leather pouch on the desk. Inside the pouch were copper goods, buttons, hinges, bowls, a bracelet, 2 years of Cora's work sold by Josiah across the Western Slope. The cash value was enough for a retainer. The attorney listened to the story. He examined the copper. He picked up one of the bowls and turned it under the window light and ran his thumb across the hammer marks, the way a man touches something he respects. She made these in the mind by herself. He took the case. The argument was specific. The original extraction rights held by Consolidated Copper had expired in 1886 under Colorado territorial statute requiring active operation or periodic renewal. They had not been renewed. Mountain Consolidated's application for new rights was pending, but not granted. In the interim period, the mine sat on public land, and under Colorado homestead law, a person who continuously occupied and improved public land over a sustained period could petition for recognition of use rights. Cora had occupied Drift Number 1 for nearly 3 years. She had improved it beyond any reasonable dispute. Her claim was not guaranteed, but it was defensible. The attorney also said, with the directness of a man who does not charge by the word, that Cora was a single woman with no family standing, no property record, and no political weight, and that the county commissioners who would hear the case were all men, and that the odds were not in her favor. Cora's response, relayed through Josiah, was this: "I do not need to win the case. I need them to see me. Oldest made me invisible for 7 years. He declared me dead to make me invisible forever. I will not do his work for him anymore." The hearing was set for June the 12th, 1891, at the county courthouse in Delta. The courtroom was a second-floor room with tall windows and wooden benches that held about 60 people. By 9 o'clock in the morning, every bench was full. Men were standing along the walls, and a reporter from the Montrose newspaper was sitting in the front row with his pad open. The story of the woman in the mountain had traveled across the county by the only means available in 1891, which was the spoken word, passed from kitchen to general store to church pew to fence line, growing stranger and more impressive with each retelling, so that by the morning of the hearing, Cora Hollister was variously described as a hermit, a prospector, a fugitive, a mad woman, and a genius, depending on who was talking and how many miles they lived from Tabletop Mountain. Cora walked into the courtroom with Josiah and her attorney. She wore the wool coat Josiah had given her, the copper bracelet on her left wrist. Her hair was clean and tied back. Her boots were clean. She was 21 years old, and she had spent 3 years answering to nobody, and she carried herself accordingly. Not with arrogance, but with the settled certainty of a person who has tested herself against conditions that would have defeated most of the people in this room, and who does not need their approval to know what she is worth. She sat at the front table. She did not look at the gallery. She did not look at Cornelius Drake, who sat at the opposing table with Victor Harmon and a stack of documents that represented the full legal weight of a mining company with resources that exceeded Cora's by several orders of magnitude. She looked at the 3 county commissioners seated behind the long table on the raised platform, and she waited. Harmon presented the company's case: clean, efficient, built on the solid ground of property law. The mine was mineral claim land. The occupant was unauthorized. Her improvements, however notable, did not constitute legal standing. The company's application for extraction rights was pending, and her presence impeded their survey work. He requested immediate removal. Cora's attorney presented her case. He walked the commissioners through the timeline: the closure in 1876, the expiration of rights in 1886, the 2 years the mine sat unclaimed before Cora entered it, her continuous occupation, her improvements, her cultivation of the adjacent land, her established trade in copper goods. He cited the homestead provisions. He cited the precedent of prior cases in which continuous improvement of public land had been recognized as grounds for use rights. The commissioners listened. They shuffled papers. They looked at Drake. They looked at Cora. The hearing had the quality of a proceeding that was going to end in paperwork and legal technicality. And then Dorothea Pruitt stood up. She stood from the third row of the gallery, a 42-year-old rancher's widow in a clean cotton dress with sun-darkened hands folded in front of her, and she asked to address the panel. Harmon objected. The head commissioner overruled the objection because this was a county hearing and not a federal court. And because Dorothea Pruitt was already standing and had the bearing of a woman who would remain standing regardless of what anyone in the room decided about procedure, Dorothea spoke for 4 minutes. She did not raise her voice. She spoke the way she did everything, without ornamentation, each sentence carrying exactly the weight it was meant to carry and not an ounce more. She told the commissioners that Aldous Hollister had filed a false declaration of death for his niece. She provided the date, the name of the county clerk who processed it, and the name of the parishioner to whom Opal Hollister had spoken at the First Methodist Church of Ridgeway about settling the estate of Aldis's deceased brother. Who was Cora's father? She did not speculate about Aldis's motives. She did not need to. The facts assembled themselves. The courtroom was still. 60 people holding their breath at the same time produces a silence that is different from an empty room silence. It is a silence with a pulse. And then the door at the back of the courtroom opened. Opal Hollister walked in. She was alone. She was not with Aldous. She stood in the center aisle, and the entire room turned to look at her, every head rotating like compass needles toward a new magnetic north. And Cora, sitting at the front table, turned too. And for the first time in nearly 3 years, she looked at the woman who had pushed her out of the only home she had known. Opal was thinner than Cora remembered. The confidence that had armored her in Aldis's kitchen on the morning of September the 3rd was gone. In its place was something harder to read. Something that was not exactly courage and not exactly shame, but occupied the territory between the two, where difficult decisions live. Opal asked to speak. The commissioners, who by this point had abandoned any pretense of procedural formality, allowed it. Opal did not defend Aldous. She did not attack Cora. She spoke about herself. She said that she had married Aldous Hollister because she needed a roof and a future. And Aldous had both. She said that she had wanted Cora removed from the house because Cora's presence frightened her, not because Cora was disobedient, but because of the way Aldous sometimes looked at Cora, which was not the way an uncle should look at anyone, and because Cora had her mother's face and her mother's eyes. And Opal could not compete with a dead woman's ghost. She said she had pushed Aldous to make Cora leave, but she had not known that Aldous would declare Cora dead. She had not known about the inheritance. When she learned, she wanted to speak, but Aldous forbade it, and she had obeyed because obedience was the price of the roof, and the roof was the reason she had married him. She said she could not obey anymore. She said the silence had become heavier than the roof was worth. Opal turned and looked at Cora. The two women regarded each other across 30 feet of courtroom floor and 20 strangers' knees. They had lived under the same roof for 4 months and had never once spoken to each other as equals, because Aldous had kept them on opposite sides of a wall that he maintained through silence and control, and neither of them had realized until this moment that the wall had been his construction, not theirs. "I cannot undo it," Opal said. "Apology is not enough, but I can tell the truth, and the truth is that I was wrong." Cora looked at Opal. She did not speak. She did not smile. She did not cry. She nodded once, a small, tight movement of the head that communicated acknowledgement without absolution. Because absolution was not something Cora had the capacity to offer right now, and might never have the capacity to offer. But acknowledgement was possible. Acknowledgement said, "I hear you. I see that this cost you something. I will not pretend it did not happen, and I will not pretend it is repaired. But I see you." 60 people turned to look at Aldous Hollister. He was sitting in the last row. He had been sitting there through Dorothea's testimony and through Opal's testimony and through the slow public dismantling of the story he had spent 3 years constructing. The story in which his niece had gone to Denver and died of fever and left behind nothing that anyone needed to recover or remember. He sat with his hat in his lap and his hands on the brim, and his face showed the same flat expression he had worn on the morning he told Cora to leave, except that now the flatness was not the composure of a man executing a plan. It was the blankness of a man whose plan had been disassembled in front of him piece by piece, and who had nothing behind it. He stood up. The room waited. The commissioners waited. Harmon waited. The attorney waited. Cora waited. The silence expanded to fill the space the way water fills a vessel, pressing into every corner, finding every gap. Aldous Hollister looked at his niece. He looked directly at her for the first time since she was 11 years old, and standing in his doorway with a flour sack in one hand and an envelope of money in the other. He looked at her, and she looked at him. And the distance between them was not 30 feet of courtroom floor. The distance between them was 10 years of silence, 7 years of unnamed labor, a stolen inheritance, a fraudulent death certificate, and a sentence spoken on a September morning in a kitchen doorway that had set everything that followed into motion. She waited for him to speak, to deny, to explain, to apologize, to say at the very least after 10 years her name. One word. Cora. It would not have been enough. Nothing would have been enough, but it would have been something. A crack in the wall, a beginning. Aldous did not speak. He turned away from Cora. He walked to the door. He opened it. He walked through it. He pulled it shut behind him with a soft click that was in the silent courtroom, the loudest sound anyone had ever heard. Cora watched the door close. She did not feel victory. She did not feel relief. She felt a hollowness that she had not expected. The particular emptiness that comes when you have carried a wound for a very long time, and you realize that the wound will never receive the acknowledgement it deserves. Not because the person who inflicted it is cruel, because the person who inflicted it is incapable. Aldous would never say her name because Aldous did not have the language for what he had done. And a man without language for his failures is a man who will carry them in silence until the silence is all that remains. The commissioners ruled that afternoon. They did not grant Cora ownership of the mine. They denied Mountain Consolidated's petition for eviction, citing the pending and unresolved status of the company's extraction rights application, and the absence of any current valid claim that would authorize the removal of a continuous occupant from what was at present public land. They recommended that Cora file a formal homestead petition through the Territorial Land Office. Her attorney filed the petition the following week. Cornelius Drake withdrew his application 3 months later. The legal costs were accumulating. The copper deposits on Tabletop Mountain were marginal at industrial scale. And the story of a mining company trying to evict a young woman from a home she had built with her own hands inside an abandoned mine was the kind of story that newspapers enjoyed and investors did not. Drake moved on. There were other mountains. There were always other mountains. 3 things happened after the hearing that Cora did not expect. The first was the money damage. Her attorney filed a fraud claim against Aldous for the wrongful collection of funds designated for a living person whom Aldous had knowingly and falsely declared dead. Aldous did not contest. He paid the $190 through his attorney. No meeting, no letter, no note in the envelope. Just the money returned the way a man returns a borrowed tool he has kept too long, without comment, without eye contact, through an intermediary. Cora used the $190 to buy proper metalworking tools, a 40-pound forged steel anvil, crucible tongs, a set of planishing hammers in 3 weights, files, punches, a swage block. She carried them up the mine road herself, 4 trips over 2 days. And each trip, the weight in her hands was her father's money becoming her father's legacy, transformed from an amount in a bank ledger into instruments that would shape copper into objects that bore her mark and carried her name. And the transformation felt like the closing of a circle that had been open since she was 11 years old and standing in Aldous' doorway with nothing. The second was Opal. 6 months after the hearing, Opal left Ridgeway. She departed on a stagecoach to Grand Junction with 2 trunks and no forwarding address. And no Aldous. The marriage had not survived the courtroom. Aldous, who had chosen Opal over Cora on the morning of September the 3rd because Opal was useful and Cora was expendable, found himself alone in a house that Opal had stripped of everything she considered hers, which included several things that had been Cora's mother's. The curtains were gone. The apron was gone. Aldous occupied the house alone, and the silence inside it was no longer a silence he administered. It was a silence that administered him. The third was Josiah. His lungs had been declining for years, 40 years of rock dust. He coughed more through the winter of 1891. His visits to the mine slowed from every 2 weeks to every month. Each time he came, he was lighter, as though the mountain air that had preserved the timbers in the drift was performing the opposite function on his body, drawing something essential out of him that could not be replaced. He came to the mine on an afternoon in late October. The aspens on Tabletop were gold and trembling in a wind that carried the first bite of the coming winter. Josiah rode his mule up the mine road one more time, and tied it to the headframe post, and walked into the drift, and sat on the stool that had become his stool, though no one had ever assigned it, and drank coffee from the copper cup that Cora had made for him, though she had never told him she had made it for him and he had never asked. They sat together in the quiet, the forge cooling, the daylight beam in the second stope completing its slow transit. "Do you know why I never built a house?" Josiah said. Cora shook her head. "Because I believed that if I stopped moving, I would have to remember Bess. That if I kept walking from one creek to the next range to the next valley, Bess was just a place I had passed through. But if I stopped, if I drove nails into lumber, if I hung a door, then Bess would be inside the house with me, and I would have to sit with her, and I was not certain I could do that without breaking." He held the cup the way a man holds something warm when his hands are cold, or something steady when his chest is not. "You stopped," he said. "You drove the nails, you hung the door, and your mother is inside these walls with you. I can see her, that pot on the table, the way you keep everything clean, the way you cook. This place is built out of memory as much as it is built out of stone, and you did not break." Cora looked at him across the fire's fading warmth, at the white beard and the thin shoulders, and the blue eyes that had been studying the earth for 4 decades, and that had found in a hole in a mountain the thing they had been searching for in every creek bed and rock face and gravel bar, from the San Juans to the Bitterroots. Not gold, connection. "You came back every 2 weeks for 2 years, Cora said. "You said it was because I might need you. But you needed to come back. You needed a door to walk through. You needed someone to pour coffee for. You needed Bess to not be the last person you sat with." Josiah did not reply. He drank the coffee. He set the cup on the table with the careful precision of a man placing something where it belongs. And when he stood to go, he reached to his belt and unhooked his rock hammer. The hammer he had carried for 40 years. The hammer that was as much a part of his body as his own hand. The tool that represented every creek he had panned and every seam he had tested, and every morning he had woken up and walked into the mountains believing that the next day might be the day he found what he was looking for. He set it on the table beside Cora's tin pot. "I will not be needing this," he said. Cora did not argue. She understood what the hammer meant. A prospector's hammer is his future. It is the physical expression of the belief that something valuable lies ahead, in the next creek, under the next rock. Setting it down was not quitting. It was arriving. Josiah had been walking for 40 years, and he had finally reached the place where walking could stop. Not because the gold had been found, but because the search had been completed. And the completion was enough. He walked to the door. He turned back. "I know you do not need anyone," he said, "but if you ever want someone to drink coffee with, I will be in Montrose." He left. Cora put the hammer on the stone ledge next to the bone button marked JP. 2 objects left behind by 2 men. The button from a man who had run, the hammer from a man who had finally stopped running. Cora kept them both, because they were proof that she was not the only person who had ever needed this mountain, and because the artifacts of other people's searches, especially the searches of the absent, are a form of companionship more durable than presence. Josiah did not die in this story. He lived for several more years in a boarding house in Montrose. He sat on the porch in the afternoons. He visited the mine when his lungs allowed, which was less and less often as the years passed. Each time he came, Cora poured coffee into his cup, and they sat in the quiet of the stope. And neither of them spoke much, because everything important had already been said. And the silence between them was not the silence of estrangement, but the silence of 2 people who have run out of things to prove to each other. Cora Hollister lived in the mine on Tabletop Mountain for 9 years. She never returned to Ridgeway. She never saw Aldous again. She never saw Opal again. She saw Dorothea Pruitt every month for years, and then less often when Dorothea sold the ranch. And then by letter, the letters addressed to Cora Hollister, Tabletop Mountain, Colorado. Because by then the address was sufficient. Everyone knew where she lived. The copper work became her livelihood. What had started as a refusal to be reduced to survival became a craft, then a trade, then a reputation. She sold first through Josiah, then directly at the Montrose market, standing behind a table with saddlebags of copper bowls and buttons and hinges, the burn scar visible below the bracelet, and the work selling itself because the work contained something that factory goods did not. Each piece held the irregularity of a hand hammer on a stone anvil, the warmth of copper smelted in a mountain forge, and the unmistakable quality of time. People who held her pieces could feel the hours in them. They could feel the patience. They could feel the mountain. Then a reporter from the Denver Republican rode up the mine road and knocked on the plank door and was admitted to the stope, where he sat on Josiah's stool and drank coffee from Josiah's cup and turned slowly in the copper light and wrote a story that ran on the front page under the headline, The Copper Woman of Tabletop Mountain. The story was reprinted in Colorado Springs, in Pueblo, in Denver, and eventually in a magazine in Chicago. And then the mail orders came. They came addressed to Cora Hollister, Tabletop Mountain, Colorado. They came from Denver and Kansas City and St. Louis, and once from a woman in New York who wanted a set of copper buttons for her winter coat. They came faster than Cora could fill them, because one woman with a stone anvil and a hand bellows cannot match the pace of demand. She did not hire anyone. She did not expand. She filled each order as it came with the same care she had given the first copper disc she hammered from the first bead she smelted on the floor of the second stope. And if the customers waited, they waited. The waiting was part of the work. The work was part of the mountain. Aldous Hollister never called his niece by name, not in 7 years under his roof, not in the letter he sent through the deputy, not in the courtroom where he sat in the last row and watched his lies come apart. He never said Cora. The word never left his mouth. But the Denver Republican printed her name on the front page, and the Colorado Springs Gazette printed it, and the Pueblo Chieftain printed it, and the Chicago Magazine printed it. And the mail orders that arrived at the Montrose post office were addressed to her by name, and the postmaster said it aloud when he sorted them. And the name passed through the town the way all names pass through small western towns, becoming part of the local vocabulary. A word that people used when they talked about copper or mountains or women who refused to be told where they belonged. Aldous read the article. He must have. Ridgeway was a small town, and the Denver Republican circulated there. And the story of his niece, the niece he had declared dead building a home inside a mountain and becoming famous for it, was not a story that a small town would allow a man to miss. He read his niece's name in print, the name he had never spoken. And whatever he felt when he read it, he kept to himself. Because Aldous Hollister was a man who had spent his entire life keeping things to himself. And he was not going to stop now. Not for a newspaper, not for a name, not for the knowledge that the girl he had tried to erase had become more visible than he had ever been. The mine that the Consolidated Copper Company had abandoned because the copper was not worth the cost of industrial extraction turned out to contain exactly enough copper for one woman with a rebuilt furnace and a stone anvil and 9 years of firelight. Not enough for a company, not enough for shareholders, but enough for Cora. Enough for a life measured not in tonnage or quarterly returns, but in the number of mornings she woke in a home she had built and walked to a work she had chosen and answered to no authority except the limits of her own skill and the demands of the mountain then sun that had taken her in. She left the mine at 27. Not because the mountain had failed her, not because she had grown tired of the work or the solitude or the cold. She left because she was finished. She had come to Tabletop Mountain at 18 with a flour sack and a tin pot and nothing else. She left at 27 with a trade and a name and money in the bank and a reputation that reached from Montrose to Chicago. And the knowledge earned across 9 years of stone and fire and silence that she could go anywhere and build anything, and that wherever she went, she would be all right. She would be all right because she had already done the hardest thing a person can do. She had built a life from nothing in the dark alone with no one's permission. And a life built by your own hands on ground you chose for yourself has a foundation that no one can take from you. Because the foundation is not the land, or the house, or the copper, or the name. The foundation is the person who built it. The mine is still there. Drift number 1 still opens into the south face of Tabletop Mountain, though the plank door is gone. And the Douglas fir timbers have softened with a century of weather. The stopes are empty, the forge is cold, the copper hooks still hang on the walls, green with 100 years of oxidation. And if you carry a light into the first chamber, you can still see where the shelves were wedged into the rock, and where the fire pit blackened the stone beneath the ceiling fissure, and where the sleeping platform stood. The bone button is gone. Josiah's hammer is gone. Time or theft or the mountain's patient reclamation has taken them both. But the bracelet exists. The copper bracelet that Cora Hollister made in the winter of 1889. The bracelet she wore every day for the rest of her life. The bracelet she made for no practical reason except that making something beautiful in a dark place was the strongest argument she knew against the idea that she was merely surviving. It sits today in a glass case in a small museum in Delta, Colorado. Beside it is a tintype photograph of a tall woman with black hair and gray eyes standing in front of a dark opening in a mountainside. Her shoulders are straight, her hands are at her sides. The burn scar is visible on her left forearm, and on her face there is the faintest suggestion of a smile. The smile of a person who has earned the right to smile by spending 9 years learning that the only permission she needed was her own. The card beneath the bracelet reads, "Copper bracelet handmade circa 1889. Cora Hollister, Tabletop Mountain, Colorado. Gift of the artist." Aldous Hollister died in 1903 in the house in Ridgeway. He lived alone for the last 12 years of his life. The silence between him and Cora was never broken. No letter, no visit, no word. But a silence you choose is not silence at all. It is the loudest thing you will ever say.